For the sermon today, I thought I would take the chance of laying one more brick in the edifice that I was building some time back entitled History and Prophecy. As all of you know, I went on for quite a little while on that particular subject, and I decided, well, I better give you a little respite, a little break from that particular line of thought. But I felt that I do need to come back to it. There are a few more things that need to be touched upon. There are some very important prophecies that I think you might be interested in as well. In fact, the things that I've been giving you up until this time are kind of the salad and maybe the first or the second course. We've got to get into some of the more interesting aspects of this, the main course and maybe the dessert and finally a cheese board along the way, so that you'll really be able to enjoy some of the things that are here for you. And indeed, one of the most interesting aspects of all this is getting directly into the prophets themselves and asking ourselves, what do they tell us about what is going to happen in the future? The next prophet in the line of those that we're going to want to talk about is a man named Hosea. He is the first of the minor prophets. Now that might come as a little bit of a surprise to some of you, since you know Daniel sits at the beginning of that, but technically Daniel is not considered one of the minor prophets. He is a part of, I believe, the Hagiographa is the name for it, which basically means the writings or the holy writings. And he is in a different category, I think, really grouped along with the Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and so forth, as far as the original groupings of the Scriptures are concerned. So this is the first of the prophets listed in what are called the minor prophets. And I suppose minor because all of their books are shorter. Now, for all of you who have managed to turn your way to Hosea, you can leave there now and go back to 2 Kings again, because I'm not going into Hosea without laying some groundwork for what we're going to do. I see Mammy's making her way back there now very patiently. She'd already just made it to Hosea by the time I said that. And now she's with us back in 2 Kings chapter 14. Now, we have, in the study that we've been doing, brought ourselves up through the history of Israel and seen the division of the 10 northern tribes from the southern tribes, and then followed the king list, as it were, through those 10 northern tribes and the successive events that took place, the change in the religion, the idolatry, and how that the first of the prophets come along, Elijah and Elisha, of the really powerful prophets, and how that their condemnation is almost exclusively oriented around idolatry. That this is the fundamental, the most problematic, the thing that made them the angriest, as it were, is the way you would put it, but the thing that seems to have made God the angriest. He doesn't get around to talking about theft and murder and the violation of the 10 Commandments, except for the first two in the works of Elijah and Elisha, primarily. And you get the impression almost that in the earliest days in Israel, that it was idolatry that was the single biggest problem. That in the beginning, in the earliest times, they had not yet gone into the wickedness that would be a hallmark of their later existence as a people. And so the first of the prophets concerned themselves with idolatry, the worshiping of other gods, the making of graven images, and the effect that is eventually going to have on the lives of these people. In 2 Kings 14 and verse 23, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria and reigned 41 years. This was probably, during this 41-year period of time, the absolute peak of Israel's power and prosperity. Their economy was at its very strongest. Their military power was at its very greatest. God had, in His mercy, allowed them to conquer some territories that had been taken away from them and to be able to restore the kingdom back much as it had been before. It was a time of peace, relative peace, and of prosperity. And as things will tend to go in such a time, people began to forget God, more even than they had to this day. The impression you get from the prophets, as it is borne out by prophet after prophet, it is, as you were increased, so you sinned against me. It seems to be the pattern, again and again and again. And that people tend more in times of trouble, when things are going wrong, when they are sick, when they are hurting, when things just aren't right, that's when they begin to pray. And that's when they start thinking about God. That's when they drag the Bible off the shelf and blow the dust off of it and chokingly go to their chair to sit down to read what might be there again. Because when everything is clicking, just really moving along just real well, and there are no needs in their life, God is human. If there is a God, is the way they would put it. They're really not that impressed. So during this time, Israel was prosperous. Jeroboam, we are told, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Now remember, we've got two Jeroboams here. The first Jeroboam was the one who established the worship of the golden calf, who moved the Feast of Tabernacles from the 15th day of the 7th month to the 15th day of the 8th month, and may not have even called it the Feast of Tabernacles, but something quite different, who indications are it may have even changed other holy days as well, and also changed the place where Israel was to worship. So he did all these things, Jeroboam the first did. This man we're talking about now, Jeroboam the second, we're told, did not depart from these. You know, it's that same tired old litany that we've been hearing as we went through these prophecies, where each king in succession, God says, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not. He continued in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who did sin and who made all Israel to sin. And his sin, remember, was the setting up of calf worship in Bethel and Dan, the changing then of the holy days, and the changing of the place and the method and the God of worship. Now, in their earliest time, as a separate kingdom, Israel did not worship Baal, they worshiped the calf. And that's different. It's not quite the same. There's every bit as much difference between worshiping Baal and worshiping the calf as there would between being a Methodist and being a Presbyterian, and considerably more. In fact, it's about the same sort of a difference you'd have between being a Methodist and being a Buddhist. They are two quite different religions, the worship of the calf and the worship of Baal. But he did some things. He restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath out of the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by the hand of his servant, Jonah the son of Amittai, the prophet, which was of Gath-Hepher. Now, this is the famous Jonah that we all know about, and this is another prophecy which is not written elsewhere in the Bible, that he prophesied that the land would be restored, that the coasts would be restored at some time in the future. Jeroboam II carried that out. This places Jonah earlier than Jeroboam II, as you can see. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter. For there was not any shut up, nor any left, nor any helper for Israel. And the Lord said that he would not blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, and all that he did in his might, and how he warred, and how he recovered Damascus and Hamath, which belonged to Judah, for Israel, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Jeroboam slept with his fathers, even with the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son reigned in his stead. In the 27th year of Jeroboam king of Israel began Azariah the son of Amaziah the king of Judah to reign. He was 16 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 52 years in Jerusalem. Now mind you, we're dealing with a king of a different kingdom. This is the king of Judah. He reigned for 52 years, otherwise, by the way, known as Uzziah. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done, save that the high places were not removed. The people sacrificed and burnt incense still on the high places. So, Jeroboam II, followed by Zechariah in the north, King Uzziah, or Azariah as he's otherwise known, in the south, in a time of relative prosperity. Jeroboam II reigns for 40-odd years, Uzziah for 52 years, and their reigns are about the same period of time. So quite a lot of stability, quite a lot of power, a lot of prosperity. And onto the scene walks a man named Amos. He is a prophet to the 10 northern tribes. I referred to him in an earlier sermon as the shepherd prophet. It's available on tape for any of you who would like to listen to it. Also at the same time comes a man named Hosea. He is the younger contemporary of Amos. Amos was older than him, actually probably began to prophesy a little bit before Hosea. Hosea, on the other hand, is the older contemporary with Isaiah and Micah. These two men prophesying in the south, Amos and Hosea prophesying in the north to different kingdoms and different place, but still somewhat roughly contemporary. And of course, Hosea might very well have known Jonah in the process of this period of time. We are at the beginning of his work something like 150 to 160 years into the history of the northern kingdom. It has been that long. It is probably in the years something like 760 to 720 B.C. It was a 40-year period of time. There were 40 years of the northern kingdom. As I've already mentioned, he followed the succession of the prophets Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, and Amos. Then comes Hosea. Now, Hosea himself is an interesting study, and I want us to go back because we are at an appropriate time to do this. His work began in the time of Jeroboam II. So if you'll turn back to the book of Hosea now, we want to introduce ourselves to as much as we know about this particular man. Hosea chapter 1 and verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea the son of Beeri in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash, king of Israel. So we have got him placed in a reasonably close time context. Obviously, he didn't prophesy all the days of Uzziah, but he came on the scene during the 52-year reign of Uzziah. He was a prophet who had a few things to say to Judah, but he was a northerner. He was a part of the 10 northern tribes, and his message was primarily to those people. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea, verse 2. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take you a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land has committed a great whoredom in departing from the Lord. Now, I think probably the commentators on the Bible may have spent more time on that verse than on the entire rest of the book of Hosea, because they found that particular statement rather troubling. Some of them have suggested, well, what he meant was that the nation of Israel was a nation that had gone into whoredoms and idolatry and so forth, and he was to take himself a wife of the nation of Israel. The Living Bible says it this way. The Lord said to Hosea, Go and marry a girl who is a prostitute, so that some of her children will be born to you from other men. This will illustrate the way my people have been untrue to me by committing open adultery against me by worshiping other gods. And I suspect that the translator of the Living Bible is dead right. Perhaps not a professional prostitute, but a woman who had had a loose reputation, a woman who had known other men, a woman who was not a virgin, was the one who was to be Hosea's wife. You know, in a flippant sort of a way, I think sometimes, some of us might think that we would like to be a prophet. It would be very exciting, to be lying in your bed some night, maybe asleep, and to hear your name called, And you said, well, like Samuel did, Samuel. And he kind of woke up, and he went in to talk to Eli and said, Did you call? He said, No, I didn't call. He went back to bed. I'd call him 3 times. How would you like to be there some night and to hear your name called? John, whatever your name is. And you sit up bolt right in bed, and a voice is there in the room, seems to fill the whole room. And there's something in you that says, I don't have to ask who that is. I know who that is. And you are suddenly going to be given a message to be carried off to somebody. That would be a real thrill, I guess. It'd be a tremendous honor, I suppose. But for Hosea, what he told him to do was to marry a whore. How's that grab you, fellas? How would you feel about that? Now, I have very little doubt that that's precisely what was involved. The reason being is because just merely marrying some girl who lived in Israel, who was a model of chastity and a very fine girl and worthy in every way of being a prophet's wife, would not have really said much, would it? It would have made no statement whatever. And the whole purpose of this entire episode is that Hosea is going to make a statement with his life. Now, it's one thing for me, if I were a prophet, to come in here and stand before you people and say, The Lord appeared to me the other night. And he said, Tell me, you people have all gone into whoredoms and prostitution and playing the harlot, and you men are running around with other people's wives, and you women are playing the harlot, and they're stealing and lying, and some of you have even murdered your neighbors, and the Lord's going to get you for all that. But the emotional impact of coming before you and saying, The Lord appeared to me, and he told me to take a wife of the daughters of whoredom, and I did. I have married a woman who was herself a prostitute. And I am a sign and a type to you people from the eternal that he has married you, and you have played the whore against him. Do you see the difference in the emotional impact of the message coming from a man who has been sent to carry this out and to actually live it in his life. Ezekiel was told that as a part of his message and a part of what he was going to do, that his wife would die. He lost his wife. As a part of a prophetic message, God took her life. She died. And this man then, having lost his wife, came forward to preach that the death of his wife had meaning for Israel, and he proceeded to preach that meaning to those people. So being a prophet is not something to just kind of be tossed off. I think by and large, you'd be far better off to adopt the posture of a Jonah in the long run, and to say, I'm not really eager to be a prophet. In fact, I'd just as soon not be a prophet. Because when the time God chooses someone, the things that you may be called upon to do could be very painful, could be incredibly humiliating, and could cost you those things that are dearest to you. It's like saying to the man, that you're going to build a house, and you don't sit down and count the cost and make your estimates and plan this thing out and say, this is how much it's going to cost. Can you really afford this? Well, fortunately for you and I, God knows whether we have the resources to follow through and be able to survive as a prophet. And that may be why perfectly good reason why none of us are, is the fact that God has looked down here and either hasn't needed a prophet, which is frankly the most likely of it all, or hasn't found anybody he feels actually could stand the gaff. It's not really a question of finding somebody worthy of being a prophet, because there aren't any of those. You're not going to depend on your worthiness or your ability or your holiness to become a prophet. It's going to depend on whether God decides to use you as a prophet and what he wants done and when he wants it done or not, and maybe whether you can stand the gaff. For your will and your desires and your fears and your hopes do get bound up in whatever else it is that God might want you to do. But enough of that. He then went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. We are not really told of where she conceived it. We assume his firstborn son was his own. The Lord said, call his name Jezreel. Now, Jezreel is a place. Unlike some of the other names that are given to children of prophets, this name is a place name. And he says, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, that's a very specific prophecy at this point in time. Now, if you'll recall, we have a man named Jehu who became king in Israel, who was anointed by God to be king, and was commissioned with the responsibility of destroying the remainder of Ahab's house, which he did. But he carried it out with such vigor and went so far beyond what God told him to do that he became an absolute bloody fiend in the process of it all. Now God says to a man at a given point in time, you're going to have a son. The name of the son is to be Jezreel. And every time you call his name, it is a living witness to everybody that I am going to avenge what happened in Jezreel upon the entire house of this king. Now, this is no end-time prophecy. That particular statement has to do with a given king in a given place in a given time. And you've got to keep that in mind as you go along, that these prophecies arose out of a specific historical context. Now, that does not mean that they have no end-time application. Don't ever make that mistake either, because oftentimes these kings of old were types of something that is to take place in the end time, and there are hints and suggestions of end-time applications in all of the prophets. Actually, fewer in Hosea than most. For Hosea's prophecies seem to be very focused toward Israel of his time and of his day. And yet the overtones are still there. The hints are still there. The warnings are still there. He goes on then to say, his wife conceived again and bare a daughter. And God said, call her name Lo-Ruhamah. Now basically in Hebrew that word means not having obtained mercy. Complicated word, quicker to say than that in Hebrew, of course. You just say Lo-Ruhamah, but it says no mercy. Strange name for a girl to have to carry around. But he said, call her name Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Now these are two prophecies. One I will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. It's not going to continue as a separate kingdom. And I'm going to utterly take away the house of Israel, all of them. 2 different prophecies combined in the names of 2 different children. But I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. Now, that also places this prophecy in a strong historical context, because it is made before the sin of Judah has become sufficient for God to discuss the final destruction of Judah as a people, right? For him to say, I'm not going to do this to Judah, we all know he did. So at this time, when this prophecy was given, Judah had not gone this far. And of course, in the days of Uzziah was a time of reform, a time of getting back to God. He was a good king. He had exercised good leadership in the south. It was going to be for considerably later that the other words would be said concerning other kings and later generations of the house of Judah. Now, when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then said God, call his name Lo-Ammi. It means, not my people. Now, as you read along in here, let's go on with it momentarily. He says, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God. Now, it sounds like what he is saying, he's reaching out here and speaking to the Israelites and saying, you may be Israelites, but you're not my people. I'm not going to claim you at all, and I'm not going to be your God. Interestingly enough, though, in the 9th chapter of Romans, Paul reaches back into Hosea and pulls out this concept of not my people as referring to Gentiles and as a prophecy of the fact that God would eventually call the Gentiles. Now, I wouldn't have jumped to that conclusion just reading along here in Hosea, but I have to respect Paul's interpretation of this scripture. For indeed what he may have been doing in naming this other son Lo-Ammi, he could have been saying, this son stands for the Gentiles. Let's keep that in mind as a possibility, for if we are dealing with this, then we are indeed looking a long way into the future at this moment in time, and with the prophecy of this boy, for this prophecy did not begin to be fulfilled until the ministry of Saul of Tarsus. Keep it in mind. All right, he said, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people. Now this tends to support the idea that not my people means Israel are not my people. But we still have to contend with Paul's interpretation. There it shall be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. But remember, Paul says that Israel is cut off like the branches of the olive tree, so that the Gentiles who were not God's people could be grafted in. And then he says to the Gentile Christians, now if you could be grafted in like wild olive branches, can't the Israelites who were cut off be grafted back in? So this seems to imply that not only are the Gentiles brought in, but the Israelites are brought back, and that could be the wording in the intent of this. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Now this is a fairly important verse, and it harkens all the way down to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and it may also harken all the way to the end time. For in truth, when Israel came back out of the land of Babylon, it was primarily, very nearly exclusively, Judah that came back. For there were relatively few of the Israelites anywhere to be found. They had already been sold, scattered to the far ends of the pagan empires. But nevertheless, they were there. And there were people, I have no doubt, of Ephraim, Manasseh, and so forth that came all the way back. Paul himself was a Benjamite, and he knew what he was. So there were others other than Judah who came back into Israel out of the land of Babylon. They appointed themselves one king. They are a united kingdom at that point in time. And that one head was a man named Zerubbabel. But you see, when you look at Zerubbabel, you suddenly realize, wait a minute, Zerubbabel, in the prophecies concerning him, in Haggai, is a very strong type of guess who? Jesus Christ. No, not some latter-day prophet. Jesus Christ. So Zerubbabel, then, in that type, looks clean ahead to the return of Christ, Jesus Christ being established as the one king of the house of David, who brings all these people, Israel and Judah, back out of captivity and reunites them in the land. Now keep in mind that what happened under Zerubbabel was a type or a model of what is yet to happen again in the future. You would not construe this from Hosea alone. In Hosea alone, you would read along and say that must just refer to the return under Ezra and Nehemiah and to Zerubbabel being the head over Israel at that time and what they were going to do. But this strange mystical person, Zerubbabel, you know from other prophecies, is typical of Christ. You also know from Isaiah that there are prophecies when the stick of Judah and the stick of Israel are going to be brought back together and bound up and made one, and Isaiah's prophecies are inescapably end time. So, what you are reading here in Hosea, chapter 1, verse 11, is not a prophecy of the end time. It is a prophecy of what was to happen under Zerubbabel, which was a type of the end time. And that is two different things, and we need to keep that in mind. Throughout Hosea's prophecies, there will be numerous references to the end time, but they are almost exclusively indirect references through types or models. Others of the prophets will do quite differently. Others of the prophets will make their prophecies directed so strongly at the end time that they are absolutely inescapable. But you remember when we started out on this quest a long time ago, in one of the earliest sermons, I cited from the 41st chapter of Isaiah a scripture where God says, let them bring forth, let them show their reasons. Let them, that is these would-be prophets, show us the former things that we may consider them and understand the latter end thereof. And that the clue is given in Isaiah that the way to understand the ultimate of prophecy is to understand the first fulfillment of what took place. That's where we are right now, looking clearly at Israel, where they were, what they were doing, and what their attitudes were. And it's a funny thing that just as things seem to happen in patterns in nature, so history tends to come around in patterns. And if we find ourselves in the 20th century repeating the pattern again, we would have to be fools not to realize that the latter part of that pattern is going to come through just as we have recreated the first part of it. And just as we have sinned the same sins, just as we have worshipped the same idols, just as we have gone the same ways, God's reaction will once again be the same. And so, as someone said, those who cannot learn the lesson of history are condemned to repeat it. Then it would be foolish of us, wouldn't it, not to at least try to learn the lessons of history. Chapter 2. Say to your brethren, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhima. In this particular case, the negative is dropped off of both those names. Do you notice that? One was Lo Ami and Lo Ruhima, which mean not my people and not having obtained mercy. Now the names are shifted to my people and having obtained mercy. Plead with your mother. Plead. For she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, and set her as in the day that she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. I will not have mercy upon her children, for they are the children of whoredoms. Living Bible basically says they're not my children, they're somebody else's children. Why should I have mercy on them? For their mother has played the harlot. She that has conceived them has done shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers that give me my bread and my water and my wool and my flax and my oil and my drink. Interesting. Can you at all relate to this? Can you relate to this man, Hosea? And realize how you would feel if your wife had left you and slept around? How you would react to that situation? Now, can you comprehend what it means to God for Israel to have left him and to have slept around? For that is the closest analogy he can draw to make you understand how he felt when our forefathers did what they did, and I suppose when you and I do what we have done. For we as Christians, enter into a covenant with Christ. And we are to be a part of the bride of Christ. Could we ever leave Him in the same way, feeling the same way, the same response? It's one thing I want you to bear in mind as we go through these prophecies. For some reason, the New Testament writers make the equation between Israel of old and the church. The church is almost referred to, and we have come to refer to the church in a sense as spiritual Israel. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said, now all these things happened to Israel and are written down as examples for our sake upon whom the ends of the world are come. And that there may be some serious and very stern warnings to the church to be found in some of these things that God said to Israel. And this thing about having a prophet actually go through the agony of having his wife sleep around on him in order that he might understand and be able to convey adequately and be able to stand before the people as a spokesman in the place of God or as a type of God and say to them, this is how it is. This is what my wife has done to me is what you people have done to God. And his reaction, while his ways are higher than mine, his love is greater than mine, his compassion is greater than mine, but one thing you want to bear in mind, his anger is also greater than anything I can muster. Therefore, behold, verse 6, I will hedge up your way with thorns. I'll make a wall that she shall not find her paths. She shall follow after her lovers and not overtake them. And she shall seek them and shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and I'll return to my first husband. For it was better then than it is now. For she forgot that I gave her her corn and wine and oil, and multiplied her silver and her gold, which they prepared for Baal. Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and recover my wool and my flax, given to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand. I will also cause all her mirth, all of her partying, to cease. Her feast days, her new moons, her Sabbaths, her solemn feasts. Now keep in mind that this is said not to Judah, who was keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, but to Israel, who was keeping something quite different. Now this is not a particular reference to that. That's not the point of this. The point of this is that all the celebrations are finished. And the ones he happens to mention are the feast days, new moon, Sabbaths, and solemn feast. It has nothing to do with the abolition of the worship of God or the holy days of God or anything of the sort. It has to do with the abolition of their festivities. Because he said, nobody's going to deliver. I'm going to cause all her mirth to cease. I will destroy her vines, her fig trees, whereof she has said, these are my rewards that my lovers have given me. And I'll make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. It's hard to imagine how God would feel, having poured out his rain in due season, having seen to it that your crops bore good fruits, and then seeing his people go out and burn incense and give thanks before a golden calf and saying, this is the God that gave me all these beautiful things that I've got around me here. This Baal, this leering idol that I've set up here, this is the one that made all these trees to grow, the sun god, and I will worship the sun and its rising. When you know that it wasn't Baal or some dumb idol or something they made with their own hands that gave them these things, you gave them to them. You can begin to understand the reason for anger. He then says, I'm going to take them, make them a forest, and the beasts of the field will eat them, and I will visit upon her the feast days of Baalim, wherein she burned incense to them. That gives you the strongest clue yet to what these feast days and all these holy days that Israel was observing were all about. They were not God's days. They were the feast days of the sun god that he says, I'm going to visit upon her, wherein she burned incense to them. She decked herself with earrings and jewels and went after her lovers and forgot me, saith the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably to her, and I will give her vineyards from thence, and a valley of Achor for a door of hope, and she shall sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that you shall call me Ishi, or my husband. You shall call me no more Baali, which means my Lord. Now, some people have made a big deal out of, or a bigger thing about the use of the word Baal, but the word simply means my Lord. And he's saying there's going to be a totally different relationship between us at this point in time. It really doesn't have that much to do with the concept of sacred names. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up your way with thorns. I'm sorry, I've already gone by that. I've slipped across the page. Verse 17, for I will take away the names of Baalim out of her mouth, and they shall no more be remembered by their name. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the fowls of heaven, the creeping things of the ground. I will break the bow and the sword and the battle out of the earth, and I will make them to lie down safely. And I will betroth you unto me forever. Yea, I will betroth you unto me in righteousness and in judgment and in loving kindness and in mercies. I will betroth you unto me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. Now, what is interesting about this is this speaks in terms of a time of the creation of a new covenant with Israel, because she broke the old one and went off and played the harlot. He said, now I'm going to punish you for this, and I'm going to reach out, I'm going to get you and bring you back, and I'm going to enter into a new arrangement with you. And you're going to be mine, and you're going to love me, and I'm going to love you. And the earth shall hear the corn and the wine and the oil, and they shall hear Jezreel. And I will sow her unto me in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her that had not obtained mercy, and I will say to them which were not my people, you are my people, and they shall say, you are my God. Now, the Hebrew in this particular segment is rather obscure as we read along it, but the Living Bible has an interesting statement on this. He says, at that time, I will sow a crop of Israelites and raise them for myself. This is verse 23. I will pity those who are not pitied, and will say to those who are not my people, now you are my people, and they will reply, you are my God. Now, as I've said, there's often a dreamlike quality to prophecy, and it does sometimes move back and forth in context of space and time and changes characters much like a dream will do without any warning whatsoever. Paul, as I said, points to the Gentiles as this not my people thing, and this almost the impression you get in the translation of the Living Bible, at that time I will sow a crop of Israelites, is almost a reference, it seems, to the reaching out to the Gentiles and making Israelites out of Gentiles. For indeed, as Paul said, they are not all Israel who are of Israel, and circumcision is not that of the flesh, it's a matter of the heart. And he makes a very strong point out of the fact that all Christians, in the Spirit, that is, in type or in the models of the Bible symbolically, are the true Israel of God. And he seems to see in Hosea, as does the Living Bible see in Hosea, a statement that I'm going to sow myself a whole new crop of, quote, Israelites, end quote. Or Zebulun, or whether they are Indian, or no matter what they are, whether they're Gentiles or what have you, they can become the Israel of God. Then said the Lord to me, go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, and adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel. He told this man, his wife having gone out and had an affair and played around, slept around on him, he said, go love her again. Go get her, bring her back, and make her your wife again, because this is what I am doing with Israel. So I bought her back for 15 pieces of silver and an omer of barley and a half an omer of barley. I guess she had actually sold herself someplace and belonged to somebody else. And so he gets his money and his barley, and he goes down and actually does his dickering and buys back his wife. I said to her, you shall abide for me many days. You shall not play the harlot. You shall not be for another man, and I will be also for you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, without an ephod, and without teraphim. Now, this basically means totally without leadership, without a husband, as it were, without love and without lovers, without a religion, because the ephod was that thing by which they inquired of God. It was the breastplate of the priest that might tell them yes or no and answer to different questions. There's not going to be any images of pagan idols. There's not going to be an ephod of the true God. There's not going to be teraphim and other kind of images. Nothing. They're going to be absolutely, totally abstinent for quite some period of time. The implication is that this is during a period of captivity. Afterward shall the children of Israel return, and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Now, all this was said to a prophet living in a specific historical time and dealing with the people who were living in that time. Let's go back to 2 Kings 15 again, just to keep ourselves in mind of where we are in all of this. Now, this is the people who had heard Elijah, had seen Elijah. A lot of these people, were the descendants, the direct descendants of, and knew by word of mouth and otherwise, particularly, of the events of Mount Carmel, when Elijah took them all up on top of Mount Carmel, and all the prophets of Baal were up there, and they set these two altars up, and they cut their animals up and put them on the altar, and they dug ditches around and did the whole rigmarole to do the test of who's God and who's not God. These are the people who, whenever they saw fire come down from heaven upon and consume Elijah's offering from off this altar, these are the people who, having seen all these things, experienced all these things, who actually said, the Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God, were actually a part of the same organization that was seeking His head in a matter of days thereafter. These were the people who had worshipped the calf, and then worshipped Baal, and then pursued every other kind of religion that may have come along that might have caught their fancy. Now, all of these things you are reading, this entire analogy of prostitution, whoredom, illegitimate children, of a woman running off on her husband, him going and having to buy her and bring her back, all of this, the image of it in Hosea's life is nothing more than a statement of what God's relationship to Israel had been during this period of time, and how He felt about the nation of Israel during this time, and what He was going to do where Israel was concerned during this time. Now let's review or continue on just a little bit in this 15th chapter to keep a perspective of where we are before we go back to the book of Hosea yet again. We are told in verse 5 of 2 Kings 15 that Uzziah was smitten with leprosy until the day of his death, and the story of that will be another sermon another time as to why all that took place, because these are the things that are going on down in Judah at this time. The rest of the acts of Azariah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And a lot of the details of this are in the book of Chronicles rather than in Kings. So Azariah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Jotham his son reigned in his stead. Hosea is still alive, still working. In the 38th year of Azariah the king of Judah did Zechariah the son of Jeroboam reign over Israel and Samaria 6 months. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And Shallum the son of Jabesh conspired against him, and smote him before the people, and slew him, and reigned in his stead. The rest of the acts of Zechariah, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Verse 13, Shallum the son of Jabesh began to reign the 19th and 30th year of Uzziah king of Judah. He reigned a whole month. For Menahem the son of Gadi went up from Tirzah, and smote Shallum the son of Jabesh in Samaria, and slew him, and reigned in his stead. It begins to appear that one of the most hazardous occupations one could have was the king of Israel at this time. The climate of violence had reached such a place that only very, very few, I think out of the last 5 kings of Israel, one of them would die peacefully. One only. The rest of the acts of Shallum and his conspiracy, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Then Menahem smote Tiphsah and all them that were therein, the coast from Tirzah, because they opened not to him. So he smote it. And all the women therein that were with child, he ripped up. In the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, began Menahem, the son of Gadi, to reign over Israel, and reigned for 10 years. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Guess what? He departed not all his days from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. It's almost as though the fundamental evil in the whole thing was that evil that set them off on the course where they now are, with the incredible climate of violence. It mentions the fact that he ripped up all these women with children, but the big part of it seems to boil down to a matter of the distortion of the religion of God, the turning of the hearts of these people away from God, and taking away from them the only path of return. I don't think people realize that whenever you deceive people about who God is, As I said before, the sins of the flesh, the mistakes that we make, the little corruptions we get into, the things that we steal can be restored. We can repent of that. We can get that straightened out. You know, if we lie or cheat or commit adultery, we can get on our knees and beg God's forgiveness. We can even sometimes put things right to some extent with other people. We can straighten these things out and we can return to God. But when we think God is over here and God is over there and we try to return to God, we keep going in the wrong direction. What I'm saying is that whenever you pervert the religion, you block people from being able to find their way back to God. You take repentance away from them. You take the chance of getting it put right away from them. Lying is a terrible thing to do. But from lying, you can find your way back to God. But when you have deserted and have worshipped a different God, what are you going to return to? A couple of times you'll find Hosea making the statement, you return, but not to me. You return, but not to the Most High. They would try to go back. They'd try to retrace their steps. But where could they go? They'd go back to a calf. Or they'd go back to Baal. Or they could go back to Moloch or one of the other gods of the Gentiles around about them. But you see, God wasn't there for them to go back to. For once you have deserted Him, once you have deserted His way, once you have rejected His method of worship, once you refuse to go to the place where He tells you to go, once you decide to worship on different days from what He told you to worship on, and then you turn around looking for Him and say, Lord, and He's not there, why should we be surprised? Why should it be a shock to people to find that God's not there when they're not doing anything He tells them to do? When they have turned away from those things that reveal the knowledge of God to them. When they no longer accept the things that actually lay out God's plan and His purpose and where He's going to be in a week or a month or a year from now. Going hunting in the mountains a lot of times, somebody will drop you off on a high ground in a given place and say to you, now, if you'll stay in this valley here and you'll cut down there and you get to that bare spot, you make a right down a little ridge there and then drop over to the left and follow that valley all the way to the bottom, there'll be a notch there. I will be at the bottom of that notch at 5 o'clock this afternoon. You work your way down there and I will pick you up. Now, if you weren't just paying a lot of attention, and if you didn't go the way the person said to go, why should you be surprised if you left out all night? If He's not there? You see, there's so much of God's Word, so much of His law, that really fits nicely in the category of telling you and I where He is going to be at what time. Now, if we don't pay attention to that, or we don't believe what He says, then the chances are we're going to get wherever we are at that time and He's not going to be there. I could draw analogy after analogy after analogy, but I think the point's clear enough. That whenever you turn away from the true religion and the way God specifies to worship, you're going to lose track of the true God, of where He is, what He's doing, what He stands for, His relationship to you, what He wants from you, what He'll do for you. The whole relationship goes to pot. In fact, it ceases to exist. And so these men, again and again, carried on the same steps of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who did sin and who made Israel to sin. Verse 19, and Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land. And Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. And Menahem exacted the money of Israel, even of all the mighty men of wealth, of each man 50 shekels of silver to give to the king of Assyria. So he turned back and didn't stay there in the land. For now. The rest of the acts of Menahem and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Menahem slept with his fathers. This is the one man among the last kings of Israel who did not die by an assassin or in prison. In the 50th year of Azariah, the king of Judah, Pekahiah, the son of Menahem, began to reign over Israel. He reigned for 2 years. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. But Pekah, the son of Remaliah, a captain of his, conspired against him and smote him in Samaria, in the palace of the king's house, with Argob and Ariah, another assassination. And so it goes. Finally, in verse 30, Hosea the son of Elah made a conspiracy against Pekah the son of Remaliah, and smote him, and assassinated him, and reigned in his stead in the 20th year of Jotham the son of Uzziah. The rest of the acts of Pekah and all that he did, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. In the 2nd year of Pekah the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, began Jotham the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, to reign. He was 25, and he reigned 16 years. His mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. He, the king of Judah, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He did according to all that his father Uzziah had done. There was one problem: he did not take away all of the high places that there were. Then comes King Ahaz in chapter 16 of Judah, and the account of his reign, the things that he did. Then in chapter 17, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea the son of Elah to reign in Samaria 9 years. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not quite like the kings of Israel that were before him. Against him came Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria. Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. He just subjugated the land to the king of Assyria during his time. The king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, the king of Egypt, and he brought no present to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. So, therefore, the king of Assyria shut him up and put him in jail, in prison. And the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. Now, this will bring us to the end of Hosea's ministry. But before we go on in Kings, I'd like you now to go back to the book of Hosea, and let's consider some of the prophecies that were being made to Israel during the time that we have just read over. We went over 40 years period there, very, very rapidly, just in the event to give you a little bit of a feeling for the passage of time and what people were doing. Reading now from the Living Bible, chapter 4 of Hosea. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel. The Lord has filed a lawsuit against you, listing the following charges. There is no faithfulness, no kindness, no knowledge of God in your land. You swear and lie and kill and steal and commit adultery. There is violence everywhere, with one murderer after another. That is why your land is not producing. It is filled with sadness, and all living things grow sick and die. The animals, the birds, and even the fish begin to disappear. Man, what a sobering thing to say, and how powerfully it is said to Israel at this time. Now remember, the earlier prophets did not give this type of indictment. Their references were to harlotry, but by that they wouldn't really mean the violation of the seventh commandment. They meant harlotry against God. They meant setting up idols. They meant worshiping Baal or Moloch or Dagon or some of these rather than worshiping the true God. But by this time, the degeneration that is natural and automatic and almost is bound to happen when people reject God as their leader, when they reject His standards, when they start playing games with His law, and when they toss it aside, sooner or later, it's going to happen. Blood touches blood. In other words, there are so many people dying that the blood from this murder runs out and touches the blood that's running from this murder, and it's just the prophet's image of saying, murder upon murder upon murder. It is a land of violence, a land of corruption, with swearing and lying and killing and stealing and adultery. I mean, what can you say? The Ten Commandments shattered. Don't point your finger at someone else, verse 4, and try to pass the blame to him. Look, priest, I am pointing my finger at you as a sentence for your crimes. You priests will stumble in broad daylight as well as in the night, and so will your false prophets too. I will destroy your mother Israel. My people are destroyed because they don't know me, and it is all your fault, you priests, for you yourselves refuse to know me. Therefore I refuse to recognize you as my priests. Why? Since you have forgotten my laws, I will forget to bless your children. The more my people multiplied, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged the glory of God for the disgrace of idols. The priests rejoice in the sins of the people. They lap it up and lick their lips for more. And thus it is, like priests, like people. Because the priests are wicked, the people are wicked too. Therefore I will punish both priests and people for all their wicked deeds. They will eat and still be hungry. Though they do a big business as prostitutes, they shall have no children, for they have deserted me and turned to other gods. Yeah, this is some of the most powerful literature ever penned by the hand of man, apart from anything else that you may understand about it as you read through it. You know, when I read this and I think about it, some things you need to bear in mind. That these priests that were the priests actually that Jeroboam had made. He made priests of the lowest of the people, we are told. But even as he went along in this, and this is true in Judah as well as it is in Israel, God does not immediately say to brush these priests aside as though they were of a totally different religion. The wording of this he almost accepts them, as it were, as his own priests. In some of the prophets, you don't get that impression from Hosea, because Hosea is dealing with these men that God didn't put in the priesthood in the first place, because he made Levites into priests. But the distinction here of true or false priest is not made in this particular situation. And I have oftentimes had the uncanny feeling, as I have read through some of these prophecies directed at Israel, that they are intended every bit as much for the church as they are for Israel. Now, when he come along here and he said, don't point your finger at someone else and try to pass the blame to him, to you, I can almost visualize the preacher standing in the pulpit with his finger extended toward the congregation, indicting the congregation for their sins. And see God saying to the preacher, don't point your finger. I'm talking to you, not to them. And those of us who are in the ministry bear a heavy, heavy responsibility for the example, for the direction, for the warning. One of the most stunning things I have ever read in my life came to me one day when I was making my way through the 23rd chapter of Jeremiah. I had never seen it before, where God was indicting men that he had never sent. He was condemning the false prophets, and he said, I never sent these men, and yet they went and preached. But he made then a very, very interesting and a very profound and a very important statement. He said, but if these men, that I didn't send, I didn't tell them anything, they went out and said the Lord said, if these men had caused my people to hear my words, then even they would have turned them away from the evil of their doings. That the Bible is strong enough to convert even in the hands of a false prophet, even in the hands of a corrupt minister, even in the hands of a liar, a cheat, a thief, an idolater, or whatever else it may be. As long as he speaks the Word. And all those scriptures come rolling back into the mind, for the Word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. God says, my Word will not return to me void. It will accomplish what I sent it to do. And if there's anything that will make a preacher, it's the book. It's the book. For without this, I don't have anything to say. I got no message to God from God to you but this. He hasn't spoken to me last night in my dreams. I didn't get any vision from God. God didn't grab hold of my ear and whisper into it. He didn't say, Ron, in the middle of the night last night, you tell these people, I have no message for you but the Bible. And if I had something else, it would be nothing but what I had, and I would be speaking out of my own heart, whatever might be there. Be it honesty, be it deceit, be it a lie, whatever. So it's here in this book that we're going to find out whether or not, the truth is being said. But this is shocking in a way that God says to the minister, take your finger down. Don't you go pointing the finger at anybody else. He said it to these priests, and as a type, they stand for any and all priests or ministers who will ever walk the face of this earth in the future. Don't you point the finger at anybody else. I'm pointing my finger at you because of the way you have led these people. And then it comes right down to all the sins, and perhaps the worst thing of all is the substitution of our own ideas and our own thoughts and our own ways and our own laws and our own commandments and our own traditions in the place of the Word of God. It's idolatry, It's idolatry, Whenever you begin to obey a priest or a minister be he a son of Levi, be he Aaron himself, when he takes you away from the Word of God, you are an idolater. You have placed Aaron, or the priest, or the minister, in the place of God. And when the time comes to return, where shall you return? For your God cannot save you. Your God cannot rescue you. Your God cannot feed you in a time of famine. Your God may die on you and leave you hanging out to dry. For any human being is subject to death. The priests rejoice in all this of the sins of the people. They laugh it up. They lick their lips for more. Verse 11. Wine, women, and song have robbed my people of their brains, for they are asking a piece of wood to tell them what to do. Divine truth comes to them through tea leaves. You know, it's so profound in a sense. He said, my people must have lost their mind. They actually take a piece of wood, maybe a divining rod, it may be some Ouija board, it may be whatever else. They're asking these things to tell them what to do. They made it with their own hands. They move it around with their own fingers. They actually shake the tea leaves in the bottom of the cup themselves, and somebody looks in there and says, you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger, and what you should do this or that. We look to stupidity. Wine and women of song have robbed my people of their brains. How much better can it be said? Longing after idols has made them foolish. They have played the harlot, serving other gods, deserting me. They sacrifice to idols in the tops of mountains. They go up to the hills to burn incense in the pleasant shade of oaks and poplars and terebinth trees. There your daughters turn to prostitution, and your brides commit adultery. But why should I punish them? For you men are doing the same thing, sinning with harlots and temple prostitutes. Fools, your doom is sealed, for you refuse to understand. But though Israel is a prostitute, may Judah stay far from such a life. O Judah, don't join with those who insincerely worship me at Gilgal and Bethel. Their worship is nothing but pretense. Don't be like Israel, stubborn as a heifer, resisting the Lord's attempts to lead her in green pastures. Stay away from her. She's wedded to idolatry. The men of Israel finish up their drinking bouts, and off they go to find some whores. Their love for shame is greater than for honor. Therefore a mighty wind shall sweep them away. They shall die in shame, because they sacrifice to idols. What a tragic thing. Now, time won't permit me to go through Hosea verse by verse. Go on to chapter 6. Actually, I want to go to the end of chapter 5, verse 14. I will tear Ephraim and Judah as a lion rips apart its prey. I will carry them off and chase all rescuers away. I will abandon them and return to my home until they admit their guilt and come to look for me again. For as soon as trouble comes, right? As soon as trouble comes, they will search for me and say, come, let us return to the Lord. It is He who has torn us. He will heal us. He has wounded us. He will bind us up. In just a couple of days, or 3 at the most, He'll set us on our feet again to live in kindness. Oh, that we might know the Lord. Let us press on to know Him, and He will respond to us as surely as the coming of dawn or the rain of early spring. Oh, Ephraim and Judah, what am I going to do with you? For your love vanishes like the morning clouds and disappears like dew. What's he saying? He's saying, I know what's going to happen. You're going to get in trouble, and then you're going to repent, and you're going to expect me to pop you right out of this in 2 or 3 days. You're going to get real good all of a sudden, and you'll just be so righteous, and you'll try to get your life all straightened out, and you'll walk down this way, and you'll say, oh, it's so good to know the Lord. He says, your goodness will be gone by the time the sun gets up. That's just how good you are. That's something we really need to be careful about. We really need to be careful about. That the frivolous attitude of, well, if I just get this straightened out, maybe God, maybe a couple of days, maybe 3 days, maybe I can get out from under this and things will be okay again. Do you know what we tend to do as human beings? We tend, as persons, to run the same cycle that Israel ran throughout the period of the Judges. Whenever things go well for us, we forget God, we run off and do the things we want to do, we carry on our lives, business as usual, and once in a while think of God, if then. Then we get into trouble. We get into trouble, we make all kinds of resolutions, and we get on our knees and pray, and the tears roll down our face, and it's going to be all better tomorrow. And God hears us, and He delivers us out of our troubles, and we forget God again. And then we get into trouble again, and we cry and we pray, and we get out of trouble. God hears us and forgives us and gets us out of trouble, and we forget God again. Do you realize what you have found in your lifetime? Whenever you have lived this kind of an up and down existence, sort of in and out with God blessing you and then you forgetting Him and then getting in trouble and you calling on Him when you're in trouble, you have found the perfect reason why God should leave you forever in trouble. For His relationship with you will forevermore be better the worse things are for you. Reckon you could ever straighten that out? Reckon you could ever come to grips with that? For some of us may have found, I may have just put my finger right there on the reason why some of us manage to spend most of our lives with things going wrong and not being able to quite ever get it right, is because we have not learned how to stay close to God when things are right. That may be the hardest challenge that a man of God or a woman of God will ever face in all their life. Can I serve God when things are right? Well, I'm going to leave you with that thought. The rest of the book of Hosea requires very little in the way of interpretation. It's just simply a chronicling of what they did and what God was going to do because of it. And it really falls out into four main themes, and you'll see it very clearly as you read through the book. Israel's idolatry, Israel's wickedness, Israel's captivity, and Israel's restoration. It is a historical event. You can go back to where we broke off in the book of Kings, and you can read carefully and understand precisely what took place and the events that followed in all of this. And you'll begin to realize, as you follow on through the history of Israel and Judah, that the ultimate fulfillment of Hosea's prophecies has not yet taken place. Only a type took place when Judah and a handful of Israelites returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple in troubled times under the leadership of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel and Haggai. You'll know it more when we come to some of the other prophets later on.